welcome you to the first panel discussion that we're having this year. This year's topic, I'm Knowles, I'm the moderator. Today's topic will focus around the constitutional issues associated with legalization of marijuana for medical use here in Connecticut. And it's a very timely issue because many of you are aware that last week the pharmacies began filling prescriptions for medical marijuana. We have a very distinguished panel today. Dr. Rafaele Fierro will talk about issues surrounding legislating morality. We'll then have Professor Bob Brown talk about issues associated with federalization and legalization. Dr. Fran Coan will talk about the 18th Amendment. For those of you who watch Boardwalk Empire, you probably know it more as prohibition, so that'll make more sense to you. And finally, Professor Marchand will talk about law enforcement perspectives associated with this issue. The format will be that each of the presenters will give his presentation, and then at the end we will take questions. Okay, so can we begin with Dr. Fierro?
Thanks for coming. I appreciate you all being here. I anticipated a pretty big crowd, considering the topic, and here we are. So yeah, drugs are dangerous. Marijuana can be dangerous. You may have heard, though you may not agree. But in a free society in which a constitution ensures limited government and the protection of personal liberties, I would say that making marijuana illegal has created even greater dangers. So let's first turn to the U.S. Constitution and see what it says. On the face of it, nothing in our federal Constitution renders marijuana illegal. Congress does have the power to regulate interstate commerce as a result of Article 1, Section 8. That's true. I believe that this clause has been interpreted way too broadly and should have nothing to do with the illegality of marijuana. If you look more closely at the U.S. Constitution, we have the 10th Amendment in place, and to me that's a more important indicator of what we should do with marijuana use. This amendment states that the powers not delegated to the U.S. Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What that means is that when and where the federal government has not spoken on the issue, then it should be left up to the states to decide. Professor Brown is going to talk about this with more detail, but it seems to me that the 10th Amendment is very relevant here. We have 50 states with their own governments in place. Let them make this decision. Now, the Constitution says one thing, but what has actually happened? Well, marijuana came into fashion as a drug of choice by the mid-late 19th century. And by the early 20th century, it coincided with the emergence of something else, and that was immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and also immigration from Mexico. And it was in particular Mexican immigrants who were thought to bring it across the borders. They would smoke it, they would use it, and it made them apparently violent, and some observers even said sex crazed. We can't have any of that. The desire to restrict all kinds of immigrants, Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Poles, Czechs, and also Mexicans, well, that was a very powerful trend that occurred in the early part of the 20th century. There was a book written by Madison Grant called The Passing of the Great Race, in which he lamented the fact that the Anglo-Saxon race was being overtaken by these impure foreigners, these aliens that were invading our shores. And he illustrates, Grant does, the extent to which many Americans of the Anglo-Saxon race were quite concerned about the issue. Immigrants were uncleanly and were undermining America's purity, so something desperately had to be done about it, apparently. And this is where the progressives come in. They try to clean things up. And they had a desire, I would say an overwhelming desire, to reform society amidst these dramatic changes caused by immigration. One of the key progressive principles was to use the power of the state, of the force of government, especially the executive branch, to reform society quickly. It was rather pesky to wait for Congress to do this. It takes time to get Congress to debate or discuss. let the executive branch handle this and things can be done rather fast. Woodrow Wilson, one of those progressives, President of the United States, said this: "We must think less of checks and balances and more of coordinated power, less of separation of functions and more of the synthesis of action." So don't worry about what the Constitution says, let's just get things done and get it done quickly. That was Woodrow Wilson's opinion. And the 18th Amendment was perfect for that. It was part of a broader progressive desire to engage in what one scholar has called ego-boosting moral exhibitionism. The 18th Amendment, as you might know, was the Prohibition Amendment. It banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. To make a long story short, it didn't work. It was quite a bad amendment, perhaps the worst. The 21st would eventually replace it after some years. But the fact is that all the 18th Amendment did, it did not eliminate drinking by any stretch. It caused crime rates to go up, especially violent crimes in the nation's urban areas. And so it became quite a problem. But this Prohibition Amendment was part of a broader progressive desire to reform, to change, to get people to behave a certain way, which to me always runs you on a dangerous path. Another part of this progressive desire for reform was to disseminate birth control so that especially the poor and especially the immigrants could reduce the number of children they had. And perhaps the worst side of that was forced sterilization. You know, this isn't often talked about in history textbooks, but state laws were passed in the early part of the century that required the forced sterilization of people so that they couldn't have children. So many progressives, not all of them certainly, but many of them were part of this desire to control people's behavior for the sake of a greater good. Progressives, it should be noted, some of them even collaborated with Nazis in the name of racial purity. By the time we get to the 1930s, there is this very significant desire to control behavior. The Great Depression simply intensified that idea. And so we have the Marijuana Tax Act of the 1930s, which essentially was the first to criminalize the use of marijuana. And after that, you have incremental laws passed that little by little made marijuana what it is in most states today. It's illegal. You have the Narcotics Control Act of 1956, which basically set mandatory sentences for drug-related offenses. And also, by the 1970s, you have the creation of federal drug-busting agencies, and that was followed in the 1980s by the war on drugs, which you may have heard of. If there is ever a war on drugs, by the way, drugs won. But it should be noted here that conservatives started this war on drugs, and you know, in terms of federal intervention, became married to this early progressive desire to legislate morality. So back to the Constitution, there's clearly tension between what the Constitution says and what the federal government has done through the course of the 20th century. Remember, we live in a society that talks about limited government, but that's not always the way it works out. There's also tension between the Constitution and some of the moral crusading sponsored by a strong federal government. And here, I think, brings us to the folly of legislating morality. The Prohibition era teaches us a lesson, certainly. If you criminalize marijuana use, for instance, the price goes up. And if the price goes up, that causes potentially more violent crimes to happen. One scholar, Thomas Sowell, says it pretty well. He says, if an addict could support his habit for a few dollars a week, he would still be an addict. But he would not need to steal, mug, or kill to support his habit. When the price goes up, those things are all possible. You know, if drugs had never been discovered, I would say this would be a far better place. But it is dangerous to think that we have the omnipotence to undo every evil. Some wouldn't call it an evil at all. A crusading mentality can easily make things worse. And it seems to me that these days the American people feed right into that. Federal officials, many of them unelected, act as moralists in many different ways. Even if some Americans believe that the federal government should legislate morality by making marijuana use illegal, if you think about it, nothing is to stop that same government from legislating morality in other areas that we find undesirable. Should the government ban overeating? That could be much less healthy than marijuana use. Perhaps the government should ban, 20-ounce soft drinks. Wait, it has already in New York City. So there is a clear precedent for these sorts of things that does cause a slippery slope of government intervention. Once the state asserts its power in one place, it will do the same in other places. That's just the natural gravitational pull of government action. So where does this leave us? If drugs are bad in some cases, but legislating morality in a manner that contravenes the Constitution is even worse, well, what do we do? To me, the answer, as always, is that in a free society, to foster a sense of responsibility in the citizenry, where marijuana use is legal, but perhaps undesirable, or at least relegated to the private sphere, it is important to note what our rights are, of course, but the Constitution implies that Americans have a responsibility to act in accordance with Republican principles, small r principles. There's a widely reported story of Benjamin Franklin. When he came out of the Constitutional Convention, a group of citizens approached him and they asked, "What have you all produced?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it." Now, to me, these were very prescient words from the bifocaled but forward-looking founding father. There are many ways in which Americans can lose their republic. One way is to allow politicians who think they know better than we do to give them free rein over what constitutes what's moral and what doesn't. We think that if America is going to be destroyed, the Gestapo will come in and take away all our liberties, but that's not typically how it works. Republics, they don't survive. They are destroyed when we, the people, give consent for officials to take the power that we forfeit. So we'll be able to keep our republic when we are active, informed, and devoted citizens who take account of our own activities rather than allowing the state to do it for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fierro. Professor Brown will now talk to us about the issues between state and federal laws associated with marijuana.
This is working? Okay, good. Yeah, I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Professor Fierro talked about. And the first one, well, some of the politics before I get into the substance of my presentation. Actually, the progressive desire to reform society is indeed quite prevalent during the period of Prohibition. And I think it does reflect a sort of a general tendency to want to legislate morality through the political process in general. I would point out that one of the organizations that opposed making marijuana illegal was the American Medical Association. They didn't think that there were any medical issues involved at all. One of the largest proponents of making marijuana illegal was actually, believe it or not, the synthetic rope making industry. Why would they be opposed to, why would they want marijuana to be made illegal? Because marijuana and hemp are inextricably linked, and hemp is the enemy of the artificial rope making, synthetic rope making industry. So the politics of it cut interesting ways. The focus of my comments is going to be on the 10th Amendment, which Dr. Fierro mentioned. That's the last of what we collectively call the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And it does indeed say, power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Which basically means if the Constitution doesn't say that the United States government has the authority to act, and it doesn't say that states are prevented from acting, then the states get to act, or the people, okay? In other words, the states retain some rights to set their own course. At the same time, the U.S. Constitution is a document that gives vast powers to the federal government over people's lives, and the federal government that lives in Washington, D.C. Attention to that. Over the past 2 years, as I'm sure everyone knows, Washington and Colorado legalized the distribution of marijuana. You can buy it wherever it's sold without worrying about having to mug, kill, or beat someone up in order to afford it. The Congress, however, has done nothing to change the federal laws regarding banned substances, and one of those banned substances remains marijuana. So while the voters in Colorado and Washington have spoken on the issue of marijuana, they have also endorsed an action that, according to the laws of the United States, remain illegal. Several other states have taken steps toward doing what Colorado and Washington have done. Connecticut, as Professor Knowles pointed out, has legalized the sale of marijuana for medical purposes, and the first of the medical marijuana shops opened up just within the past week. One of them is in my town of Bristol. So Congress has never endorsed marijuana, by the way, for the purposes of dealing with illness either. We have a contradiction between Washington, D.C. and all of those states that have moved to one degree or another toward legalization. I think it's arguable that a few hits on the bong would probably help our politicians in Washington, D.C. It might mellow them out, make them more reasonable, or at least a little more focused, but that's not the key point. We have an example of attention that is as old as the country. Do the states come first, or does the national government take precedence? That was a constitutional principle supposedly settled by the deaths of 600,000 people during the American Civil War. The states of the Confederacy arguing that the states predated the nation, and that therefore the states could leave if they found it in their best interest to do so. The Civil War, however, ended up with the reunification of the nation, thus seemingly putting an end to the question. Yet it keeps bubbling up to the surface from underneath. In the early 1960s, for instance, the Civil Rights Movement brought the issue of federal versus state authority to the fore once again. The U.S. Supreme Court in the 1950s had ruled that interstate travel had to be integrated. Trains, buses, planes. Yet, in the small towns of the South, where the bus stations are, that the Trailways, Greyhound, Peter Pan buses travel, they remained segregated. They had separate facilities, not just for gender, but separate facilities for blacks and whites. The group of civil rights protesters, a group of civil rights organizations, a coalition in 1961, mobilized the Freedom Rides. The goal of the Freedom Rides was to travel across the South, stopping at the bus stations and deliberately violating local customs and regulations. Whites would go into black restrooms and blacks would go into white ones. Illegal in the states of the South, but of course the Supreme Court had decided that interstate commerce had to be integrated. Southern segregationists set fire to one of the buses. The Freedom Riders spent several harrowing nights fearing for their safety. President Kennedy had to turn to federal marshals to keep a very tense peace. Eventually, the Freedom Riders made it to Jackson, Mississippi, where they were jailed for violating state law. It took the passage by Congress of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to put legally enforced segregation on the road to extinction. In the current case with marijuana, we have Congress doing nothing to change the law and nothing to force the states to change their policies. The Obama administration's response can best be characterized by sort of a don't ask, don't tell in the area of the sale and distribution of marijuana. We won't ask you what you're doing, and you don't have to tell us. Oregon, Washington, California, Connecticut, any number of other states. So far, so good. Potheads, casual users, people undergoing treatment for cancer can do what is permitted by the laws of their states. What happens, though, if another election produces a very different kind of presidential administration, which is possible? Dr. Fierro talked about the fact that the war on drugs has its origins in the 1970s and the time when actually we had very conservative presidents of the United States, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. What if we have an administration that takes a hard line and controls substances of all type, marijuana included? It's not too hard to imagine that happening. There are some very traditional people in both political parties, though more in the Republican Party than the Democratic one. If one of these people should find himself or herself in the ascendancy in the White House, we probably won't have another civil war over states' rights. Marijuana, after all, tends to relax and mellow. People who are relaxed and mellow are far more likely to make love than war. So we're lucky there. But this is a tension that will remain as long as there is a federal system of government, one that makes room for both state authority and federal authority. It was put there from the beginning and on purpose, Our founders, especially those who thought the Constitution paid too much attention to the powers of the central government, wanted the 10th Amendment to sort of create another level of government. And as a result of their concerns, the people of Washington, Colorado, even Connecticut get to smoke what they want to and buy it without fear of getting busted, at least for now. We don't know what the future will hold. And to follow up on something that Dr. Fierro said too, my solution to the war on drugs is to, back in the 1960s, an early political critic of the Vietnam War, Senator George Aiken from Vermont, had a simple solution to the problem of Vietnam. He said, say we won and bring our troops home. That's what I think we should do about the war on drugs. Yeah, we won, it's over. Okay, now we can legalize everything and regulate it and legislate it and keep people from having to pay exorbitant sums and stop maintaining an insane price support system for organized crime. I mean, it's the war on drugs that's created organized crime in the 70s, 80s, 90s, in this current decade. So, in any event, that's it for me. I still say legalize them all. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. That was very interesting. And now, Dr. Coan will talk to us about the 18th Amendment.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk that much about the 18th Amendment. I'm going to talk more about the amendment process, but I will certainly refer to the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment, which was the only time the country actually changed its mind and repealed an amendment. So we've already learned today that the Constitution is silent on the role of the national government in establishing and enforcing drug policy. There's no mention of drugs or anything like that in the Constitution anywhere. Whether you look at Article 1, Section 8, which gives the enumerated powers of Congress, or anywhere else. So this would seem to be an area that is reserved to the states to decide. On the other hand, under Article 1, Section 8, Congress does have the power to, quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Dr. Fierro already referred to this clause. And it also has broad powers to do that which is necessary and proper to carry out the enumerated powers, the so-called elastic clause, which could be read any which way. So it may well be that the national government does have powers to play a role, at least, in regulating drugs in the country, at least assuming if those drugs are part of interstate trade or international trade. So constitutionally speaking, who possesses jurisdiction over drug policy? Is drug enforcement a matter for the states alone? Is it a concurrent power to be shared between the states and the federal government? Or indeed, does the Constitution grant broad powers to the national government to establish and enforce policy? And Professor Brown referred to this innate tension in the Constitution, which has existed from the beginning. There are a lot of areas that are gray, where it's not clear who does have jurisdiction. I do wish to point out, however, that the Constitution features a mechanism that may serve to clarify the respective roles and powers of the state governments and national government in making drug policy, and indeed in many matters. This mechanism was employed almost a century ago as the nation debated what to do about another perceived drug problem, namely that of alcohol. And obviously I'm referring to the amendment process, and specifically the 18th Amendment, which was ratified in 1919, which granted the national government broad powers to regulate alcohol, and then consequently the 21st Amendment, ratified in 1933, which rescinded the 18th Amendment. So we could get into the story of prohibition. Nobody's actually done that, and I'm surprised, but it's a long and complicated story. It has a long history in the United States, in point of fact. So long before national prohibition, there were attempts on the state and local level to, first of all, persuade people, particularly men, to either drink less or preferably drink not at all. But also there were legislative efforts to curb the sale and distribution and use of alcohol at the state level. And in the 19th century, there were a number of states that actually, at least for a time, had their own form of prohibition. I don't know if you knew that, but national prohibition was not the first prohibition in the United States. And certainly there were a number of counties and local communities that went dry during this period, and some of them still are. So national prohibition really has a long history behind it. Its roots, I kind of like this quote, so I'm going to read it. National prohibition sprouted in the soil of rural, southern, and western evangelical Christianity and populism, fertilized by urban, eastern progressive principles and goals. I just like that, so I read it. But again, it was really a coming together of various movements and groups in the United States. And by the early 20th century, that movement had gained a lot of momentum. By 1917, 24 states had already passed their own versions of prohibition. So when national prohibition was instituted, actually in 1920 it was first enforced, already about half the states had their own version. So there was a lot of groundswell to do this. Without getting into all the problems of prohibition, obviously there were many: enforcement, criminalizing a once legal activity, enriching people who were willing to break the law to get alcohol to people who still wanted it. 16 years after Congress passed a prohibition bill, the country decided this isn't working, it's created more problems than it solves. And the 21st Amendment was ratified, and the national prohibition experiment ended. So I could discuss briefly the process by which the Constitution can be amended, just briefly. Typically, it's 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate will propose an amendment to support that. And then 2/3 of the state legislatures. The other process is 2/3 of the state legislatures may call a constitutional convention, and they can decide to propose an amendment. But that's only the first step. The amendment, if it passes this far, then has to be ratified by either 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of the states in special conventions, and Congress can choose the method of ratification. So whichever method is used to propose and ratify an amendment, it absolutely requires a broad-based supermajority and widespread support. Very difficult to do, and it was meant to be very difficult to do because the framers wanted the Constitution to be stable, the bedrock on which this new national government was built. They didn't want it altered on a whim constantly. So to date, there have been thousands of amendments proposed or talked about or introduced in various places, but only 27 have been ratified. Extremely difficult to do. But that in itself, the amendment process gives a degree of legitimacy to whatever amendments survive to be ratified. So the 18th Amendment was certainly the product of a lot of support in many parts of the United States. There was a groundswell of support for prohibition at that time. And Article 6 actually reinforces that idea. So if the Constitution or any legislation passed under the Constitution, and this would certainly include amendments, quote, shall be the supreme law of the land. So from a constitutional standpoint, although the national government has accrued enormous powers to itself to wage the so-called war on drugs, it's still unclear exactly where it derives many of those powers. A constitutional amendment will help clarify this matter, as unlikely as it is that such an amendment will ever be proposed, let alone ratified. And I certainly don't support such an amendment, but I am pointing out this would be one way to clarify the balance of power between the national government and the states in this area. Absent such an amendment, and again from a constitutional perspective, most drug policy is best and most properly left to the individual states to decide. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coan. So we've had some good background on the constitutionality and the regulation of this issue. And now Professor Marchand is going to talk about the law enforcement issues associated with legalization of marijuana.
Good morning. I was a little surprised when I was asked to be on this panel this morning, but I definitely jumped at the chance. I thought to myself, how often or how likely am I ever going to get this close to a history professor flash mob again? Probably never. Again, I was honored actually to be here this morning to add whatever I can to this morning's discussion. I brought flashcards and everything you're supposed to do as a speaker. But quite frankly, I'm going to talk from what I bring to the table. And what do I bring to the table is I've spent about 34 years in law enforcement. And a bit of a movie buff. And I like to quote a famous movie star, and that's Charlton Heston. And I believe he would say best if he said, "Politicians, keep your stinking paws off my Constitution." From a police officer's point of view, we've had an example of what happens when we mess with our Constitution. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution prohibited alcohol. And I would like to point out the city of Chicago as an example of this. Prior to the amendment, Chicago was a quintessential city that enjoyed many of the benefits of most of the country. However, due to its geographical location and the makeup of the population, Prohibition actually turned it into what we have today, and that is, unfortunately, the murder capital of the United States. The introduction of alcohol as a prohibited substance turned Chicago into a hotbed of criminal activity. We know Al Capone and many of the other stories, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and the ridiculous loss of life associated with that type of decision. Now we have a discussion this morning that we're thinking about changing the Constitution when it comes to the substance of marijuana. Interestingly, as a police officer, one of the things that I've realized is that as a police officer, the ability to use our discretion, all of the current laws that are in effect do not prohibit us or demand that we make arrests for any of these substances that we are so all familiar with. As a local police officer, we make arrests based upon our state statutes and not felony arrest based upon our statutes handed down by the federal government. Our Connecticut state statutes do not use the word shall when we describe our drug laws. As a matter of fact, as a police officer, fortunately, our state only mandates approximately 4 examples of shall. And those examples, quite honestly, are the fault of our police professionals and their past behavior. One of them is family violence. You shall make an arrest in the event of family violence. Why? Because unfortunately we have many cases in the past where police officers, through the use of their discretion, chose not to. And so when we fail to do what is necessary, our politicians step in and they mandate. Well, I don't believe a constitutional amendment is necessary, nor would it be beneficial. Quite the contrary, I think it would in turn result in very similar situations, perhaps in Colorado or other locations. So, from a perspective of a police officer, I am definitely against a constitutional amendment dealing with the legalization of marijuana. Thank you.
Thank you all, and we now have a lot to think about, so we'd like some questions. I'll bring the microphone to whoever has a question for any or all of the panelists.
For people that are employed, what is the state going to do when it comes down to people that use medical marijuana, but also as a job where they're permitted, they can't smoke marijuana?
I believe under the Safe Work Act, we currently have substance abuse rules and regulations in place in our places of employment, our schools, that dictates when a person, regardless of what the substance should be, and in this case you're asking me about marijuana, whether or not they can be under the influence of that while they're employed or doing whatever we happen to hire them to do. And currently there's plenty of rules and regulations in place that control that type of situation. So I don't think the concept of marijuana actually changes anything that's currently out there. If you you are employed in a business and it's a dangerous business and you possibly may lose fingers or toes or something while you're under the influence, we're certainly not going to allow you to consume marijuana simply because now perhaps we do pass some type of legislation that makes it an acceptable substance. So I don't see a significant impact or change on that.
Well, it's sort of a related situation. Several summers ago, I was teaching American government. We were talking about the issues of religious freedom. And a police officer in my class, who's actually today he's the police chief at CCSU, Greg Sneed, asked a very good question that I hadn't thought about. He said, what if you belong to a religion that has marijuana as part of its rituals and sacraments? And he was thinking in particular Rastafarians. He said, do we have to let Rasta cops smoke marijuana? And the answer is no, you don't. You set workplace rules and conditions, and you can, and the police department can do what it wants to establish those rules and conditions. But I thought it was an interesting question because it just sort of highlights another element of our complex Constitution, the First Amendment, the one that deals with Congress not establishing religion and nor prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So it's another little sort of twist on the debate. So.
My question is basically that, you know, I think it was the early 20s, morphine, heroin were legal and then became illegal. But the pharmaceutical companies had started making like heavy narcotics that is causing a problem of addiction in America. Yet the contradiction of making marijuana legal for medical purposes is, you know, having such a hard time making this decision when there's proof that there's less, you know, addiction and less problems with people that use marijuana versus heavy narcotics such as fentanyl and OxyContin, et cetera, if that makes any sense.
Can you just ask the question a bit more directly?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I need to take public speaking again. There's such a heavy weight right now on, you know, the medical use of marijuana, which I am for. Yet, the pharmaceutical companies are pumping out, you know, pills that are damaging our company with addiction, you know, and I don't know why there's more focus on decreasing the use of pharmaceuticals as far, you know, instead of, I think there should be more weight on that than the terms of the use of medical marijuana, which would not cause the negative problems that the narcotics use.
No, I get the question.
I'm sorry.
It's a good one. I think part of it goes back to the early 20th century, the time period I talked about a bit. And what you have there is the fact that marijuana was being used by a certain group of people, at least that was the stereotype. Mexicans as well, but also by the 1920s, marijuana use became prevalent and associated with the jazz era. And so you have a select group of people stereotypically using African Americans, Mexicans, and you know, it all comes down to what the government says is illegal, that's what's illegal. And the fear was that if these so-called dangerous people are doing it, then that should be the drug that's focused on for criminalization. And I think that's a big part of it. So I'm looking at it from an ethnic perspective and a racial perspective. There is that element. And you know, with these pharmaceutical companies, they're selling these drugs that, as you say correctly, I think are much more addictive and dangerous potentially. But part of that is the federal government, through the FDA, demands that these pharmaceutical companies distribute these drugs. So one is rendered legitimate, the other illegitimate, depends on what it's used for and who is using it.
The use of the illegal trade in prescription medication is an interesting element in the overall war on drugs. And I think that, you know, in point of fact, unsuccessfully, the nation has attempted to put in place rules, legislative or regulatory, that are designed to assure that many substances can be distributed, but only through a recognized, legal, regulated process to the Food and Drug Administration. What happens is doctors overprescribe. What happens is people steal doctors' prescription pads. What happens is somehow or other it gets on the street and people buy it. I would point out that this is not something that's linked to the flow of drugs into the United States from other places. This is something that this is our homegrown problem. But yeah, the goal was to attempt to regulate these things, and that hasn't worked either. I think that unlike in the case of the other substances that we've been talking about, I think that the solution for prescription medications is to ramp up enforcement, to make it, to crack down, because there is a process in place to assure that these things are not abused, and yet abuse still happens.
Hi, I'm just kind of curious about cannabis oil. I've done a lot of research on it, and it's something that you don't get the same high off of it. You don't really get any high. It's just used specifically for treatment, and it's a viable cure, or something. For some illnesses, they don't have a cure, so it's something that puts people into remission. And I've done a lot of studies, and I'm not seeing too many bad side effects. People seem to feel better on it, and one of them is something that either you're on antibiotics for 5 to 10 years or for the rest of your life even. And they're trying, you know, there's new studies out saying that chronic conditions where antibiotics are used are very dangerous, because you're now more susceptible to superbugs and you get antibiotic resistance. What's your feeling on the cannabis oil parts? That you don't get the high, but you still get the benefits of using that product?
Well, I've never tried it, so I don't know. But, you know, you're bringing up a point which actually dovetails with this young lady's point, too. Perhaps one of the fears of legalizing medical marijuana, first of all, there's a fear that this is simply an intermediate step to legalizing, or at least decriminalizing marijuana, period, and then maybe other drugs, too, is, again, I'm not a medical expert, how much do we really know about the long-term effects of marijuana, in that it's been a drug that's been illegal for so long in the United States? So I would be surprised if it's been studied systematically as much as some other drugs, certainly as drugs that have been approved by the FDA, for example. And the bigger issue, I think always, the elephant in the bedroom, so to speak, is the moral issue. You know, obviously there's a great moral debate that still continues in the United States over which substances should be illegal, which should not be legal. And certainly marijuana still fits in that category, perhaps less so than it did a generation or two ago, but it's still there. So I think one of the fears that people automatically have is, you know, if we legalize this, what are the long-term ramifications? Are we going to be creating a new generation or a larger number of drug addicts? If so, how do we deal with that?
Well, I don't know a lot about cannabis oil either, but if you look at the current trends of, you know, where we are as a country in terms of how acceptable marijuana use is, certainly over the last 5 years or so, you've seen a trend in favor of legalization, especially for medical use. you know, there's an increasing number of states who are moving in that direction if they haven't done so already. I would anticipate that that would continue pretty indefinitely for, you know, as far as other states moving in that direction. And I think, as Dr. Coan says, that then once it's made legal, you can conduct more systematic studies to determine whether, you know, there are side effects to it. But we're certainly moving in that direction, and you know, democracy is a powerful thing, and I've seen a definite change in tone, national tone, on this issue.
Interestingly, marijuana, I think, is inappropriately placed as a Schedule I drug, and it was done so under the DEA. The guideline for a Schedule I drug is that it has to have a high potential for abuse, it has to have no medical use whatsoever in the United States, and it has to have a lack of safety standards for its usage. And unfortunately, when they placed the substance, marijuana, on the list, specifically the THC in the marijuana, I think they inappropriately did so. Because clearly we see that this substance does have a medical use, and therefore I think it should be removed from the Schedule I drug. It should not be in the same categories as the others, such as opium and some of the others. So your question is a great question. You know, why are we so fearful of experimenting with different forms of this substance when clearly we can actually have it removed from Schedule I by their own parameters because it does have a medical use?
Thank you. The Bill of Rights was drafted to reassure that rights would never be violated. Okay, everybody understands that. And so, as it's been said here, that there's supposed to be an alliance. The federal government is supposed to have an alliance between the states, not a government body over it. Okay? So, I hope this question what we're talking about, but does the notion of federal judges having a lifetime job and being able to overturn laws, was that something reinvented after the Constitution was made, or did the forefathers actually say that was the way it was supposed to be? Is that understandable?
So the question is the tenure of federal judges specifically?
Well, I know marijuana is the issue, but there's so many issues going on, the medical laws, okay, transferred over to the states to make a tax law to change the definition of it so the federal government wouldn't have to deal with it. Okay, so Judge Roberts took care of that definition. That was clearly in the paper. So they have the right to change our view of life and for life. So I'm just curious about how, you know, these people are going to look at our lives in relationship to marijuana. You know, that's it. If that makes sense.
Well, you're asking a couple of questions there, I think, and making some other points. But if the question is, do the courts have a lot of influence over drug policy? I would say yes, they do, absolutely. And a lot of these laws have to be adjudicated. People may challenge them. They have to be interpreted. So yes, whether that's good or bad, and if it's a federal law, obviously federal judges will be involved.
Yeah, I just pulled out my U.S. history text today because I wanted to confirm that what I was saying was in fact accurate. It's always nice to be right on points of fact. And you know, obviously this is known. The first three articles in the Constitution, Articles 1, 2, and 3, deal with the structure of our federal government. Article 1 deals with the executive branch. Article 2 deals with the legislative branch. And Article 3 deals with the judiciary. Of the three, the one dealing with the judiciary is far shorter than is by far the shortest. And basically, it doesn't exactly give the federal court system explicitly the right to decide constitutional questions. That's a right that the Supreme Court assumed for itself in the early part of the 19th century with the great Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, ruling in a very complicated set of circumstances that indeed it is the job of the Supreme Court to decide what's constitutional and not constitutional. So, but basically, yeah, it's a debatable point, and Marshall enshrined the notion of judicial review, as it's called, with his decision, but it doesn't really say that outright in the Constitution. So, to a certain extent, there's a little bit of a power grab that went on back then.
Just one last point about that, and then Thomas Jefferson and a group of Republicans in Congress did their damnedest to impeach John Marshall, but they never quite got that far. So there is a mechanism in the Constitution to address certainly judges who overstep their constitutional bounds. It's been rarely employed.
It was a family thing too, because Marshall and Jefferson were cousins, and they didn't like each other.
Just curious, what's your stance as far as or how did cigarettes become legal, but marijuana is illegal? For example, the health issues with cigarettes are far worse than marijuana, especially with the way they're regulated. There's lots of deaths that are caused. They cause lung cancer, you have mouth cancer, or gum cancer. It's one of the leading causes of death over time in our country. I mean, luckily, we've really had a war on that, and as far as America goes, we're reduced as far as cigarettes are. Other countries that are starting, that's a different story. But in the term of the legalities and through Congress, how did they end up becoming legal, but marijuana isn't?
It's also a good question. It relates back to what we were talking about earlier. I'm not convinced, though, that, just from a personal perspective, that marijuana use would be necessarily safer than cigarettes. But, I'm not an expert on that. I would have to see more studies to convince that. I've read conflicting reports on the dangers of marijuana. And I do think Dr. Coan is right that the moral issue does come into play here. But as far as banning marijuana use and not nicotine, I think that does get back to the early 20th century. A lot of these laws and how they were designated had their origins in the early 20th century. One of the other audience members was right to point out the fact that all of these drugs were legal at the start of the century, and then the federal government decided which to regulate and which not. So you really have to go back to those roots in the early 20th century.
I also think there's a political element here too. Tobacco has a powerful, organized constituency in the states of the Upper South: Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, Kentucky, and people there vote. People there rely on what has long been a legal substance for their livelihoods. And for the longest time, the federal government subsidized tobacco growers, sort of cementing the connection between political power and economic power. So basically, it's because the weed grower doesn't have a constituency like that. I think that's a part of the answer.
Can you talk a little bit about the law enforcement nightmare that might exist if, say, we had federal policy that said one thing, but that states and local kinds of areas tried to legislate, specifically on if they wanted to be dry from that point of view, or they didn't? And what's happening in Colorado, which is saying, it's legal here, and what that means on the federal level with, federal authorities and what's happening there?
That's an excellent question, and it's actually the nightmare that's in effect right now. As I was explaining earlier, as a police officer, and as for my criminal justice majors in the room, we're going to choose which part of the criminal justice system we wish to enter. Some of us will become federal, DEA, FBI. that particular part of our profession, we're going to be responsible for enforcing federal laws and rules and regulations. Conversely, on the local side, we're going to answer to our state constitutions and also to our local politicians and the morals that are found within our communities. And that's the exact nightmare that we're currently facing. And it is actually one of the things that I used throughout my career. Currently, we have drug laws because of the fact that through an executive order from the President Nixon, he established both the DEA and the Food and Drug Administration. From those agencies, they decided what substances the federal government would direct its enforcement actions towards. To answer the nicotine question, nicotine is not on their list. It doesn't appear on their Class 1 schedules, so it's not a priority. And so the other substances are there. Now, through a fault or perhaps through design, when you read the federal rules and regulations and laws, they too don't say that you shall arrest. And lacking that direction, and secondly, the fact that as a local officer, we can't make an arrest on a federal law anyway, our hands are kind of tied. So as a replacement, our local states and local towns have come up with their own rules and regulations and state laws. The only reason we make an arrest in the state of Connecticut for possession of marijuana is because there's a state statute, 21A 279C, which makes possession of marijuana illegal. So one of the things that I enjoyed through my profession was the word, I get to choose whom and when I'll enforce that state statute, discretion. And I think it's really important that as a society, we start going forward and understand that discretion should be part of our decision-making process here. And so I hope I'm answering your question. In the state of Connecticut, we choose when and when not to arrest. And we do that because of the fact that our state statutes do not dictate that we have to. And then secondly, the few laws that are out there, the federal laws, we don't have the power to arrest somebody. If I were to walk into a bank and there were a bank robbery in progress, if I were to take that person into custody, I would be taking them into custody for the fact that he's violating a state statute that says that armed robbery is against our law. We have to understand that there's quite literally nothing in that bank that belongs to us. None of that money has my picture on it or name. So when a bank is robbed in the state of Connecticut, technically it's the FBI's responsibility, but they don't come out. I mean, they're too busy now with the terrorist issue. So discretion, it's left to us. It's created a nightmare. Some states are more, I can't speak on a lot of other states. However, I was a police officer in Florida. And in Florida in 1979, an ounce or less was legal. So it varies from state to state.
Judy, I think the functional question here is it's been deferred down the road. It's sort of well, the folks in the Obama administration, the folks in Obama law enforcement agencies, I guess the impetus for the policy comes from the very top, but they don't seem too concerned about what's happening in Colorado and Washington. When the nightmare is going to happen is when you get a presidential administration that does care and thinks that there is a larger, probably moral issue at stake, and that's when you're going to see state power and federal power coming into conflict with one another. I guess that'll be a matter for the courts to adjudicate.
I don't think the people of Colorado are necessarily happy about what's happened, even though they voted for the legalization of it. But what you had, from what I've read, are a number of people coming from out of state and just descending upon their state, and it's caused all sorts of chaos that way too. And that's what happens when you don't have uniform laws across the 50 states, especially with an issue like this.
If I recall, I remember reading a story about somebody trying to get on an airplane with their marijuana purchase in Colorado to fly out to another state, and whoops, you can't do that. So you're right to bring up this absolute mess in terms of the conflict now between the federal statutes and the state law.
There is one thing, though, to make it more appealing. Typically what will happen is the federal government will step in and they'll say, okay, yes, it's certainly a matter of you may, but here's what you may have if you choose to do so. This is an article that says police will target drivers using their cell phones. $17,500 will be divided amongst about 20 people in the Wallingford Police Department. Those 20 people are patrol officers, and they'll be paid overtime to watch you and I drive by and to issue tickets if you're on your cell phone. And so they use a carrot and stick approach. So, you know, as our profession, unfortunately, bling is everything. They'll pay those 20 people $17,000 to get them into compliance, and it works. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a real problem for us to be programming our GPSs in a parking lot and receive a ticket for that. That's one of the scenarios I just heard from a student in class. But it's under this new cell phone law. You actually can't be in a parking lot. If your cell phone has the ability to GPS or to play music, if you are utilizing that item and you are either in a parking lot or on a street, you're in violation of this cell phone law. If you're not moving. Now, please bring some sanity into this law.
But I think that's the point I was trying to make in my presentation, that once you start on this path toward state power, then you don't know where you're going to wind up. I mean, that's where we are. I mean, as far as being in a car, you know, cell phone use is not permitted, but you know, eating in a car is okay. That could be just as dangerous. So I assume some politician somewhere at some point is going to make a law saying there's no eating in cars. Certainly no overeating in cars, because that would result in all sorts of other problems. No eating fatty foods in cars. So that's the slippery slope argument that I was referring to.
No soda larger than 12 ounces.
A lot of New Yorkers, by the way, have ordered 2 10-ounce sodas. So you can do that, but you just can't have it together, 20 ounces.
When we look at the addictive properties of like alcohol and other drugs, marijuana doesn't really fit into that category, because we have like organizations like AA and NA and other legal activities such as like gambling and stuff being addictive and ruining people's lives, and they haven't really regulated that because it can be controlled. With like, you can't really just grow alcohol or grow lottery tickets at your house. You have to go out and purchase them, and they're taxed and other things like that. Do you think that they haven't regulated pot yet because they can't control it and that anyone can grow it?
Yes.
Surprisingly, believe it or not, Connecticut does have a state statute that requires that your marijuana be taxed. There's a certain amount that if you're found in possession of, there is a state statute that finds you in violation of not having your marijuana taxed. And so we've thought of it. If we can tax it, we'll do it.
The story you said about the guy trying to take marijuana from Colorado and get on a plane with it. Now, if it's illegal federal, how does the state plan on getting their marijuana seeds? If it's illegal to transport marijuana from state to state, if it's not legal, what are the federal laws plan on doing about that? Because if marijuana is illegal to grow, if it was illegal to grow in Connecticut, we don't have the seeds to grow it. So where are we going to get the seeds from to grow it? It has to come from somewhere. And then therefore there are federal laws that are being violated. So what do you take on that?
Well, again, I think it's back to enforcement. Can that law be enforced? Will it be enforced? And obviously people might just try to evade the law to avoid the possibility of breaking the law or being caught.
I wasn't asked here to take over the conversation, and I hope I'm not stepping on the panel stuff. Quite frankly, actually, the marijuana seed, until it's planted and it goes through photosynthesis, it does not contain the substance THC, and within the state statute, it actually talks about that fact. And so there are certain parts of the marijuana plant that are not illegal in the state of Connecticut. Stems, seeds, however, you can't have them because of the fact that they are still, a Schedule I drug, and when planted, they will produce that substance. So again, it's quite a quagmire and confusing issue.
Hi, mine's a question of economics. I know that in Colorado, when different places of business opened up to sell marijuana, the problem that they were having was there were no banks that would take their money because the banks are federally insured, and so there was this, this problem between the two. So I wonder, how can a business, does a business put itself in jeopardy by trying to follow the state law, being able to sell the marijuana, but on the other hand, there's no bank that will take their money, so there's a lot of cash around, which created another scenario where people were robbing the places and all that kind of thing. So what kind of things can businesses do to sort of figure out how to handle their business?
That's actually news to me. I had no idea that would be a reverberating effect of the law, but I think it also, as we've been saying, comes down to enforcement. The danger of having a law that's not enforced is just as bad as, having no law at all. And it's very cyclical. You get an administration that plans on enforcing, and it doesn't square with the democratic process, and there's going to be even more chaos. But as far as those businesses are concerned, I really don't know what the solution is. If enforcement becomes an issue, then they're going to have big problems. You're saying they have problems now, though?
They did at the beginning.
Yeah, I don't know that.
He was creating this cash economy there, and that created this other level of crime because they couldn't find anyone to take their money.
Well, the fact of the matter is that much of the trade and acquisition of marijuana is they're dollars, and the dollars carry the odor or some of the stuff of what the person was carrying in his pockets or her pockets, and that sometimes marijuana. It's the cash nature of the thing that fascinates me. The simple solution is to say no cash, just credit. But I'm not sure that that's a feasible solution when you're talking about the sale of marijuana. Because you don't have to deposit your credit card receipts into the bank. So, but that's largely a frivolous solution. I think that the banks are just going to have to decide among themselves that money's money.
This whole discussion really goes back to the way the country was set up under the Constitution, where there's this innate tension between the powers of the states and the national government. And there are times that just is going to go unresolved, or there are times the states may assert their power, or the national government will, and it will go back and forth. But it's both a strength and a weakness of a federal system.
I kind of want to talk about what this gentleman up here said, and I'm going to get personal when I talk about this, but first of all, I know a lot of people that smoke marijuana regularly, whether for, just because they want to or for insomnia or whatever, and they have steady jobs, they've actually improved their lives, they have great incomes, and their lives don't seem to be altered by marijuana. Personally, I have a medical issue where I was taking narcotics and heavier narcotics, and it brought me into severe addiction. And that's one of the issues that I have with the DEA not cracking down enough. For example, if people are aware of the issue with Dr. Sternstein, you know, where he was providing so many, you know, narcotics to individuals, like enough to kill like 5 people, he would give to one person. So they would sell like them, make $2,000 and have enough for, you know, get themselves high forever. Yet marijuana, I have never seen these issues. So, you know, as far as it being a class 1, people that stop using marijuana don't go through intense detox, like where it's an unimaginable pain. They don't incite violence. They don't, you know, there's not larceny problems with them like there is with other drugs, and I believe that the narcotics is responsible for many of these problems. Basically, like, marijuana should be legalized as, you know, and instead we need to put more focus on the DEA cracking down more harshly on these doctors who are giving out prescriptions and increasing addiction in our country.
I agree with that. I think too much of the focus has been on marijuana use, and there are so many harder drugs out there that if the government is to get involved, ought to be focused on. I do think, though, we run the risk of underemphasizing the potential dangers of marijuana use, not among people who are in their, you know, college dorms and, you know, smoking a joint. I'm not talking about that, but there are some studies out that do say that, especially among teenagers, marijuana use does affect very adversely your brain development, and that's something that I think should give us some pause. I don't know that the verdict is out completely, that it's a completely safe drug, safer than cigarettes per se. But that's not the reason to make it illegal, and that's my point. There are all sorts of dangers in society that the government has no business involving itself in, regardless of the dangers. You know, if that were the case, then we ban walking the street, you know, because you could get hit by a bus, and it's unsafe to walk Route 6, but we don't do that, not yet anyway.
And, you know, law enforcement is never going to solve the problem. We know that. If there's a demand for a substance or what have you, there'll be somebody to supply that demand. So I think moral suasion is important, particularly for those of religious bent, but certainly public education is extremely important too. And for drugs, I think treatment. You know, we really need to invest much more in those. In terms of cigarettes, that has borne fruit, has it not? If one looks at the percentage of Americans who smoke today versus 50 years ago, you know, that percentage has plummeted. And that really hasn't been through law enforcement. That's been through a changing of minds, of the culture.
From a police officer's perspective, clearly when I would go on a call and I would go in a home and I would say to one of the people I encountered, I'd say, "What's your dog's name?" And they'd go, "Oh, that's 420. Conversely, if I went into an apartment, I said, "Oh, what's your dog's name?" And, "Oh, that's Speedball." I had a different approach because I've never met a marijuana addict in my entire time. The substance does not belong on Schedule 1. It does not meet the parameters, and clearly we need to look at this again.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank our panelists and all of you who attended with some great questions. I think we had a very productive conversation and look forward to more of these sessions. Thank you all.